Hey folks, today I'm going to continue on a topic that I've mentioned in a few other videos of this, the California Trail and the westward migration in the 19th century. So today I'm going to read this little booklet about Elijah Stevens and the wagon party that came over, and is credited as the party to first successfully bring wagons over the Sierra Nevada. And normally I would just jump right in, but I feel like I have to set the stage a little bit first, and kind of say give a little background and context for this trek that they were taking. So this California Trail period, and the Oregon Trail as well, but these migrations began in the early parts of the 19th century, but the part where they started to become more general, and the first attempted use of the California Trail. This picture's kind of gray, so it's a little bit hard to see very much in it, but this is showing the United States, or at least this western part. And so at this time, in the 1840s, early 1840s, the United States ended here. So if you're going to trek across the world, and these earlier routes were mostly up the Oregon Trail, finishing off in Central Oregon. If you were going to make this trek, you're leaving the United States, and you're going to go some 1,700 miles, 1,900 miles. You're basically going to walk from the edge of the civilized United States to basically uncharted land, and certainly foreign country. And specifically, if you're going to try to do this to California, it was explicitly a foreign country. You're going to Mexico. So you did not have the protections of the United States, and you're going to be in a new country. And this is not a drive or a ride. You're going to walk most of the way. Most people walked. Your wagon was for your possessions and your food and staples, but pretty much you walked all the way. And so if you're going to do that, what drives a person to do that? This is equivalent, or nearly equivalent, or roughly equivalent, to basically going to the moon. You're going to leave the edge of the United States, head across an unknown land to and end up in an unknown land. And it's going to take you months to do this. So it's pretty amazing that folks tried to do this and successfully did this. And another piece of the context for when this Elijah Stevens party began this route to California is, what was California at that time? So this is before the gold rush. If we talk about the phases of this westward migration, it's definitely divided into two distinct periods. You have before the discovery of gold in California, and you have after the discovery of gold. And in this early period, this is before the discovery of gold, California is not populated with many Europeans. It's a Mexican territory are part of Mexico, and settlements are far and few between. And most of the towns we know of today didn't even exist. There was a sleepy place called Yerba Buena that had some 1,000 some odd residents at this time, which is, now San Francisco. And you had various ranches and so on, but you really had very few major settlements. There was really nothing there. But that's not to say that there weren't some people who saw the potential of California. And one of those was John Marsh. Marsh had land grants for large parts of land in California. And he sort of knew that the best chance for him holding on to that land was if California could become part of the United States. And he saw there were other interests beginning to look at California. You had Russian settlements in the North Coast area, Fort Ross and that area. You had others. So he began to promote California as a destination and talking up the wonderful climate and farmland and opportunity in California. And so he was instrumental in convincing a lot of people, or some of the people at least, to head for California, which was even more uncharted than the route at that time. Was a little bit more established to Oregon. It was safer, more well known, and more traveled. This branch off to California was still being figured out, and especially no one had been able to successfully cross the Sierra. Now, a lot of these people, Marsh, of course, would downplay this, get those people on the road, and then they kind of have no choice but to try to get across. But he didn't tell them that nobody had successfully managed to get wagons over the Sierra Nevada mountains and into Central California or into the Delta region. So these people didn't appreciate what they were getting into, I'm sure. And so in this period before the discovery of gold, something like 2,500 people used this California trail. Once gold was discovered, now we're into the gold rush period. In that period, over the next roughly 10 years or so, it was something like 250,000 people traveled this route or traveled into California on the various routes that emerged and developed. And so that's what this looked like for this Stevens party, heading out from Council Bluffs, Iowa, in 1844 to a place that's not even the United States. Gold has not been discovered yet, so they're going there because somebody told them that there's good farmland and good weather, and it's supposedly a relatively easy trip. No problem. And that sets the context for this group of immigrants heading to California in 1844. And this is an absolutely epic tale. I mean, you've probably never heard of Elijah Stevens, and you've probably never heard of this party which attempted this and succeeded in getting to California in 1844, or they left in 1844 anyway. And but it's an absolutely epic tale. And I'm going to read this little pamphlet book, which tells the story in some 20 pages. But if you want to read a really, just simply amazing story about this and other parts of the California Trail, but it has a great narration or a great telling of this Elijah Stevens party trip. in much more detail, and it's practically poetic. It's this book, The California Trail, by George R. Stewart. It's absolutely a fantastic book. And this book was actually put out in the 60s, but you can still get this book. I noticed it's either still in print or back in print again. So you can actually buy a brand new copy of this book, which is an absolutely fantastic book. And it covers use of the California Trail and lots of stories and different parties doing it from this period, from 1849 to 1841 to 1859, which is when the railroad was then completed, and trail use was cut off or significantly reduced. Kind of ended this amazing wagon migration period. Once the railroad was completed, it became, instead of a many-month journey, it was, I think, 5 or 7 days or something, and of course it's much safer by rail. So that's the way people tended to go. And this book is different. This book probably wouldn't be too easy to find. It's a kind of a limited edition. But what this one talks about is actually the route, or actually covers the trail all the way. It's got maps and stories of the trail they took and almost like a diary, day to day, where they went, and it gives ideas of places you can actually go and explore in these maps. And so this book is pretty wild. And I've done a little exploring of some of the places where they went, but it's pretty amazing. This book is called The Trail of the First Wagons Over the Sierra Nevada, a guide by Charles K. Graydon. So with that setting of the scene, let's jump into this book about Elijah Stevens and the party, the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party. On November 25, 1844, a small wagon party of families immigrating to the new promised land called California became the first pioneers to take their wagons successfully over the summit of the Sierra Nevada mountains. They opened the first practicable wagon route to California along what was later to be known as the truckee route to California, or the truckee route of the California Trail, This courageous group of pioneers was the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party of 1844. Many of the more significant events of their journey west occurred in what was later to become Nevada and Placer counties, particularly in the eastern portions near the two beautiful Sierran lakes now called Tahoe and Donner. Unfortunately, most people, unless they happen to be immigrant trail history enthusiasts, have never heard of the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party. Who were they? Why were they immigrating to California? What did they accomplish? What became of them? My hope in presenting their story is to shine a new light of recognition on the historically significant role this small group of pioneers played in the early settlement of our state, recognition which has eluded them for far too long. The Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party was a well-organized group made up of 10 families and several single men seeking a better life for themselves and their loved ones in California. The initial 50 members of 26 men, 8 women, and 16 children would ultimately reach California with more people in their wagon party than when they left, due to the births of 2 babies and suffering no deaths along the way. So parties before and after them seldom had all members make it without a death or 2, in some cases many deaths. But this party, every single member made it, and 2 new additional members joined it with the birth of 2 babies along the way. Can you imagine that? Anyway, sorry. Truly a remarkable accomplishment, especially considering the trails and hardships they would face during their journey west. The Murphy family, headed by patriarch Martin Murphy Sr., comprised the largest family group of the wagon party. Their numbers totaled 23 persons, including those related by marriage. Mr. Murphy was a true immigrant in every sense of the word, seeking religious, political, and economic freedom, and determined not to rest until he found them. He left his homeland of Ireland in 1820, seeking larger freedom in the New World, and settled with his family near Quebec, Canada. The family grew and seemed to be doing well, yet something tugged at the elder Murphy. In 1840, he moved his family again. And there's a picture of Murphy Sr., Martin Murphy Sr. This time across the border to the western wilds of Holt County, Missouri. The Murphys owned and cultivated several hundred acres of farmland, and by all accounts seemed happy in their new home. Unfortunately, the scourge of the West, malaria, would take the lives of Mr. Murphy's wife, 3 daughters, and a son. These sad events, plus the lack of formal Catholic religious instruction in the region, persuaded Martin Murphy to search again for a new home. After hearing a visiting Catholic missionary, Father Hocken, speak so highly of the glorious climate and fertile soil of Mexican California, a country under a government of which Catholicism was the established religion, the elder Murphy knew what he had to do. The Murphy family's new home would be in this wondrous new land called California. And there's Martin Murphy Jr. Dr. John Townsend, his wife Elizabeth, and her younger brother, Moses Schallenberger, whom they took in after he was orphaned, made up the other family, whose name is applied to the wagon party. Dr. Townsend, a licensed physician, was born, raised, and schooled in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. After settling for a time in Ohio and then Indiana, he and his wife, along with Schallenberger, would make their new home in Buchanan County, Missouri, in 1841. Not long after reading about California and its seemingly heavenly qualities, Dr. Townsend decided that they should make one more move west. It was later written about Dr. Townsend that he was a man of vision and keen perception of what the future would bring. He would ultimately become the first licensed physician to practice medicine in California. Dr. Townsend truly felt that this move west to California would allow his family the chance to share in all opportunities of this new far-off land in the Pacific coast had to offer. So there's a picture of Dr. Townsend. This reminded me, I'm going to break out for just 1 second and talk about how, many streets in major cities in California, San Francisco in particular, but also some in the South Bay and Sacramento, are named after many of these early pioneers. And of course, I'm reminded of Townsend Street in San Francisco. But there's many others. Eddie, many. I could almost do a whole video about that. Elijah Stevens, the elected captain of the wagon party, was born in South Carolina in 1804. The family later moved to Georgia, where he was raised and trained in the trade of blacksmithing. During the 1820s and 30s, Stevens hunted as a free trapper in the Northwest fur trade. He spent these years sharpening all the skills of survival so necessary for the rugged and often dangerous life of a trapper in the mountain wilderness. Little did he know how well these skills would come to serve him in the historic events which were to occur later in his life. In early May 1844, while employed as a blacksmith with the Indian Sub-Agency in Council Bluffs, Iowa, the lure of the West enticed him to join the wagon parties of Dr. Townsend, Martin Murphy, and others who were preparing to cross the plains and mountains to California and Oregon. Although Stevens was considered to be somewhat eccentric, taciturn, and solitary, his will was unyielding, and his leadership qualities were easily recognized by the other members of the wagon train who elected him their captain. One of the party members later wrote in his recollections of Stevens, "We had great confidence in our leader. Although some historians have chosen to spell his name Stevens with a V, numerous recorded documents show that he signed his name Elijah Stevens with a PH." And this is the only known photo of Elijah Stevens, the same one that's on the cover of this little book. And I'll talk more about this photo later. Another individual who played a key role in the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party was Caleb Greenwood. Like Stevens, he was a rugged and skilled mountain man, but he had hunted and trapped in the Pacific Northwest and Great Basin regions during the fur trade era. So old Greenwood was hired to pilot the wagon train to Fort Hall, Idaho. He was accompanied on the journey by his two half-Crow Indian sons, John and Brinton. All three Greenwoods would go on to play important roles in the journeys of later overland immigrant wagon parties. In the late spring of 1844, the various groups of westward-bound immigrants who met to organize on the banks of the Nishnapotna River in southwestern Iowa actually consisted of a majority who were going to Oregon. Some accounts have set this combined group of immigrants at 140 people and 40 wagons. The trail to Oregon had been opened in the late 1830s and officially opened to large-scale wagon migration in 1843. Although the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party made up a small portion of the overall immigrating company of 1844, their role as leaders of the wagon train was established with the election of Elijah Stevens as the captain of both the Oregon and California-bound immigrant parties. The Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party were the only immigrants of 1844 whose sole purpose was to go to California. And on the cool, rainy morning of May 22, 1844, they jumped off from the east bank of the Missouri River near Council Bluffs, Iowa, beginning their epic journey westward to California. Their first major obstacle was the crossing of the Missouri River. The winter of 1843-44 was one of the wettest on record, and the high water level of the Missouri only complicated an already difficult crossing. Quick side note that these river crossings were some of the major events of this trek, this migration trek across the country. They were always dangerous and always brought a lot of concern to the travelers. They were able to negotiate the use of a primitive flat-bottom vessel owned by a local Indian, and in it the wagons were safely ferried across. But because of the swirling river water, the oxen became frightened and disoriented, and several would not leave the muddy riverbank. Many of them became hopelessly stuck in the mire. As a last attempt, two men started across in a canoe, leading behind them one of the more relaxed oxen by a rope tied around its horns. The other oxen were then coaxed to follow the lead of the first one and swam safely over. Unfortunately, some of the animals became stuck in the mud and had to be left behind. This greatly upset some of the Oregon contingency, for some of their animals happened to be the ones that were abandoned. This and a few other episodes of disagreement eventually led to the Oregonians breaking off from the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party to go the rest of the way on their own. In all, the California-bound Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party would cross 18 rivers during their journey west, and although the Missouri crossing posed many difficulties which they overcame, their biggest battle with a river was yet to come. Here's a little map of the route. You can see starts in Iowa, goes through what is now Nebraska, Wyoming, a little corner of Idaho, a little corner of Utah, through Nevada, and then into California. The route across the plains of Nebraska kept them on the north bank of the Platte River, on what would be later called the Mormon Trail. Okay, that's one other quick note that I'll take. This route, especially the Oregon Trail, these routes typically followed rivers all the way. You tend to jump from one river to another all the way. And there's just one section that breaks from that, which is called the 40-mile desert, where there was no river anymore. It was the first time in their long journey when there wouldn't be a river. And they'd have to go that distance without following a river. They made excellent time en route to Fort Laramie, Wyoming, arriving on June 20th. Here they rested and reprovisioned for several days. Schallenberger later recalled in his reminiscences of the trip about 4,000 Sioux encamped around the fort, which only increased their fears of possible skirmishes with Indians during their trek across the plains. But they experienced no such trouble from the Sioux, nor from any other tribes of Plains Indians during this part of their journey. Continuing to travel west, they camped at Independence Rock, Wyoming. This was to become one of the more recognized geographic features along the Overland Immigrant Trail, where thousands of immigrants would scratch their names and dates of travel on the granite surfaces of the Great Register of the Desert. The Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party camped here for a week, again to rest and make meat, but also because Mrs. James Miller was about to give birth. The arrival of the new member of the wagon party came on July 4th, 1844, and the proud parents named the baby girl in commemoration of the time and place Ellen Independence Miller, the first child born en route to California bound to a California-bound immigrant wagon party. Our pioneers now numbered 51 persons. And here's a photo of Ellen Independence Miller. And by the way, this Independence Rock in Wyoming, you can go there. It's right along a roadway. It's easy to get to. It's a short hike. And you can hike around there and see these carvings that many of these immigrants put into that rock. It's really cool. About mid-July, they were set to cross the Rocky Mountains, the great continental divide of our still young and expanding country. South Pass was crossed with little effort, for although it is nearly 7,500 feet in elevation, the rise is so gradual and the pass itself so wide, many immigrants did not even realize that they had made the crossing until they reached Pacific Springs on the westerly slope of the Rockies. They saw that the water ran towards California, and their hearts were rejoiced as though already in sight of the promised land. They arrived at the Big Sandy River in southwest Wyoming around July 21st. Now they had to make the first of many strategically important decisions of their journey. Should they play it safe and continue to follow the established trail looping down to Fort Bridger, or should they take a suggested, reportedly shorter cutoff? One of the wagon members, Isaac Hitchcock, who was traveling with his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, and her 6 children, had remembered this high mountain desert region from his fur trapping days in the 1830s. He told the party that it was only 25 miles across to the Green River. After much discussion, a vote was taken and it was agreed on to take the cutoff. Believing this to be only a long day's march, the immigrants made no special preparations to carry extra water or cut grass for the oxen. After traveling all day across a rough, broken country, they were forced to set up a dry camp in the middle of this desolate region. That night, around a dreary campfire, Mr. Hitchcock must have had some serious explaining to do. At daybreak, they pushed on and finally made it to the Green River by midday. From here they continued and were soon back in mountainous country. They reached the banks of the Bear River in southwestern Wyoming and rejoined the route of the old trail as it headed north to Fort Hall. In spite of the difficulties they encountered by taking the cutoff, it did shorten the route by 46 miles and saved nearly 5 days' travel time. This important, more direct route, pioneered by Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party, would be used by later immigrant wagon parties and recorded in their journals as Greenwood's Cutoff and later Sublet's Cutoff. With no immediate obstacles to overcome, the wagon party again made excellent time, arriving at Fort Hall, Idaho on August 10th. They camped for several days at the old fort, which was once a fur trading outpost for Hudson's Bay Company. So I'm going to break away again. Note that they left in May, and now they're here, Fort Hall in Idaho, and it's August. Now, they had to leave in May because they couldn't leave too early. There wouldn't be enough grass on these plains for the animals. But they can't leave too late, or the snows are gonna be already there in the Sierra, and it'll become impassable. So it's a very tricky timing they have to have. But now it's August, and they're in Fort Hall, so they're in Idaho. Besides the obvious need for a well-deserved rest and restocking of provisions, the need for more definitive information about the route to California was equally important. Other than the opening of Greenwood's Cutoff, the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party had been following the well-defined route of the Oregon Trail. Beyond Fort Hall, the trail to California was not so evident, and in actuality no trail for wagons existed. Two preceding immigrant parties, Bartleson Bidwell in 1841 and Childs Walker in 1843, tried unsuccessfully to take their wagons all the way to John Sutter's settlement, New Helvetia, in California's Sacramento Valley. Unfortunately, all accounts show that they were able to acquire very little in the way of new information about the route. But after nearly 3 months on the trail, they must have had confidence in their abilities to fend for themselves, and they pressed on to the west. They left Fort Hall on August 15 and followed the Snake River to the Raft River, which swung south off the Oregon Trail. Here they parted company with the Oregon-bound immigrants, who continued their journey toward the lush Willamette Valley in northwestern Oregon. Schallenberger later wrote, "The parting with the Oregon party was a sad one. For all their differences, there seemed to be some sincere friendships made among the two contingents during their journey west." The Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party now began the most important part of their historic journey to California. The next few months of travel across the desert regions of Nevada, through the icy waters of the Truckee River, and over the seemingly insurmountable summit of the Sierra Nevada, these obstacles and many others would present to them the greatest test yet to their courage, stamina, and fortitude. After leaving the Raft River, the party followed the faint tracks made by wagon wheels of the Childs Walker party of the preceding year. They followed the tracks to the headwaters of the Humboldt River in northeastern Nevada, and on October 1st arrived at the Humboldt Sink, where the river abruptly ends in the desert sands of midwestern Nevada. So now it's October 1st, and if you have been in the Sierra Nevada area, once October is coming, you any day now, you could be caught in a snowstorm. So now they've come, and they're all the way down here where this Humboldt River ends, where I mentioned they now don't have a river to follow. And this is October 1. Here they made another of the many key on-the-spot decisions during their journey west, this time regarding which direction they should continue to pilot their wagons. From the Sink, the Childs Walker wagons had turned in a southerly direction. They eventually got their wagons as far as Owens Valley, where they were abandoned, thus becoming the first immigrant wagons to reach California soil. But the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party knew that the land which they sought lay due west. Schallenberger recalls it best when he later wrote, "Many anxious consultations were held, some contending that they should follow a southerly course, and others held that they should go due west. Finally, an old Indian was found called Truckee, with whom Old Man Greenwood talked by means of signs and diagrams drawn on the ground. From him it was learned that 50 or 60 miles to the west there was a river that flowed easterly from the mountains, and that along this stream were large trees and good grass. Captain Stevens, Dr. Townsend, and Joseph Foster, taking the newly found Indian along as a guide, rode out to find this river of which he spoke. They returned 3 days later to report that everything was as had been told to them by the Indian. The decision was made to break camp and continue on a westerly course across a desert region to the river and into the mountains that lay beyond. Remembering their past hardships with crossing the uncharted region of Greenwood's cutoff, the immigrants prepared for this desert crossing with 2 days' cooked rations and all the water they could carry. They proceeded across the sandy alkali flats, stopping near a desert hot spring around midnight to make camp for the night. Hours before the next day's sunrise, they were again on their way. From here on, the wagon tracks they made in the desert sand would be the first of their kind to pass this way. They were pioneering a new route to California. This section of trail that they were opening would later be known as the 40-mile desert. In later migration years, because of the fatigue experienced by the immigrants and their animals from already having traveled nearly 2,000 miles and the extreme conditions encountered while making this crossing, the sands of the desert would be littered with the carcasses of thousands of cattle, countless abandoned valuables and wagons, and hundreds of graves of immigrants who did not survive the fearful crossing. Yeah, this 40-mile desert region, even today, is kind of scary because it really is out there in the middle of nowhere. And you're kind of on your own. You know, and when the immigrants would cross this desert, they would travel at night and sleep during the day because it was just too hot to do anything during the day. In the early afternoon of October 10th, 1844, they could see in the distance the green tops of trees growing along the river. They camped for 2 days to rest and allow the cattle to eat all they could of the lush, fine grass growing on the banks of this new found river which flowed east from the mountains. In gratitude for his help, the immigrants named the river Truckee, in honor of the old Indian who had welcomed them to his land and guided them to the river. Here's a picture of Numago, grandson of Chief Truckee. Many years later, Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, the granddaughter of this old Indian, would write of his life. He was in fact the chief of the Paiute Indian nation that called this desert region of Nevada their home. The immigrants mistakenly thought that his name was Truckee because he always answered their questions with a word that sounded like that. In fact, truckee is a Paiute word meaning all right or very well. Sarah told an ancient Paiute legend of how the first father had once banished 2 of his children, a white boy and girl, never to return home until they could live in peace with their dark-skinned brothers and sisters. According to her, Chief Truckee thought that the members of the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party were his long-lost brothers returning home, so he welcomed them with open arms and joyful heart. You know, and that's another aspect that we won't cover in today's discussion, but as much as that great Western migration, and, you know, at this period there was kind of this thinking of, there was like this inevitability of this Western migration that manifests destiny idea. And while this Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party had good relations with Indians pretty much throughout, of course it wasn't so great for Indians as a whole and the Native Americans as a whole. They, of course, you know, would not see this as a wonderful, great migration. They would see it as an annihilation in many cases, and would have a much different story. Chief Truckee had befriended John C. Fremont during his exploration of the area in 1843-44. Later, while serving with Fremont's California Battalion during the Mexican War of 1846, the rank of captain would be bestowed on Chief Truckee. He continued to help later immigrant wagon parties, and in all the writing and remembrances of Chief Truckee, not one ill word is used against him. He died in 1860, a hero to his people and true friend to his white brothers. His memory lives on with the town of Truckee Meadows, and the river to which he first guided the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party, the Truckee River. By now, the immigrants were becoming increasingly concerned about the time of year. It was the middle of October, and the ever-increasing chances for snowfall in the still distant mountains weighed heavily on their minds. They followed the Truckee River, crossing the wagons from bank to bank about once every mile. After several days of increasingly difficult travel, they came to a grassy open area to be known later as Truckee Meadows, near the present site of Reno, Nevada. Continuing due west from the meadows, the Truckee River Canyon becomes much steeper and narrower, and the river crossings became even more difficult and numerous. On one day alone, they had to cross the river 10 times in less than a mile of travel. In other places, there was nothing left to do but travel directly in the river itself. The immigrants labored knee-deep in the icy water, coaxing and helping the fatigued oxen, whose hooves now grew increasingly soft and painful from the constant wet conditions and rocky surface of the riverbed. A light snow was beginning to fall, making the immigrants all the more anxious to get through this extremely difficult part of their journey. At night, camps were made near whatever feed was growing on the riverbanks. This usually was nothing more than a type of tall river grass which stuck up through the deepening blanket of snow. After several days of struggling up the river, where each mile of travel marked a major achievement, they arrived at the forks of the Truckee River and Truckee Creek, present-day Donner Creek. On the evening of November 14, 1844, a light snow was falling as they hurriedly set up camp. That night, the members of the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party would once again find themselves facing a crucial decision. Which stream should they continue to follow? The larger Truckee River, which veered off in a southerly direction, or the smaller creek, which flowed in a westerly direction toward the mountains that they still would have to cross? Winter was upon them. Moses Schallenberger later wrote of their decision. After considering the matter fully, it was decided that a few of the party should leave the wagons and follow the main stream, while the others should go by way of the tributary, as that seemed to be the more promising route for the vehicles. So, the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party would now divide into two units. The main group would continue with the wagons in a westerly direction toward the Sierra summit. The other group, comprised of 6 persons on horseback, would continue to follow the southerly course of the Truckee River and hopefully reach New Helvetia first, so as to send back fresh animals and supplies for the main wagon party, which they must have presumed would still be working their way out of the mountains. For now, we will follow the exploits of the horseback party, for their adventure of courage and stamina is an incredible story in itself. The 6 members of the horseback party consisted of 4 men and 2 women: John Murphy, Daniel Murphy, Oliver Magnet, Francis DeLand, Ellen Murphy, and Elizabeth Townsend. They were all young, strong, and well provisioned for their journey. It is interesting to note that Elizabeth Townsend, a married woman, chose to join the horseback party on the more dangerous mission, rather than continue with her husband, Dr. Townsend, in the relative security and numbers of the main wagon party. Perhaps one could speculate that after nearly 2,000 miles of traveling overland together in the confines of a small covered wagon, she and her husband thought that they could use a little time away from each other. Nevertheless, the horseback party now was on its own. Their course along the Truckee River lay before them, and beyond that the great unknown region of peaks and valleys of the mighty Sierra Nevada. The horseback party left the campsite of the main wagon party on the morning of November 15th. They followed the banks of the Truckee River, arriving the next day at its source, Lake Tahoe. As far as can be determined, they became the first Euro-Americans to stand on the shores of this magnificent alpine lake. During his second exploring expedition of 1843-44, John C. Fremont, accompanied by his cartographer Charles Preuss, made the first recorded mention of Lake Tahoe while scaling a distant mountain peak on February 14th, 1844. With Mr. Preuss, I ascended today the highest peak to the right, from which we had a beautiful view of a mountain lake at our feet, about 15 miles in length, and so entirely surrounded by mountains that we could not discover an outlet. Unfortunately, Fremont and Preuss did not have the time to venture down to the shores of the lake for further exploration, for they were in the midst of their own life and death struggle in attempting a midwinter crossing of the Sierra Nevada. With snow continuing to fall, the horseback party had no time for sightseeing, and they resumed their journey along the west shore of the lake. They ascended a stream, now McKinney Creek, which took them up and over the natural rim which surrounds Lake Tahoe. It has been theorized by many historians as to why they would have followed this particular creek. There were 4 other large streams located between the Truckee River and McKinney Creek, which flow into Lake Tahoe along its west shore. I believe that they indeed may have tried to work their way up each one of these creeks, perhaps being turned back by rugged, steep canyon walls or a snowpack too deep for the horses to travel through. Nevertheless, they did find the inlet of McKinney Creek. Following it to the banks of the present Rubicon River, they found themselves out of the snow and soon reached the middle fork of the American River. Although this route was exceedingly difficult, complicated by the fact that they were without any prior knowledge of the area, it is completely possible for people either on horseback or foot to traverse this rugged terrain, something indigenous people of the region had been doing quite successfully for thousands of years. Indeed, the horseback party must have located these very same Indian trails which meandered along the shores and streams and rivers that they were following. Now, I've been in this area a lot. It's McKinney Creek, Rubicon River area. And in fact, nowadays, if you've heard about it or you know anybody that does off-roading, this Rubicon Trail that area is the Rubicon Trail, and many parts of that Rubicon Trail are the same, or thought to be the same as the trail this horseback party, the horsebackers, took. The horseback party of the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party. Continuing to follow the middle fork of the American River, they eventually worked their way to its main branch, experiencing many hardships and dangers along the way. Because of the steep, narrow canyon through which the American River flows, they found themselves having to cross from bank to bank many times. Adding to the danger and fatigue was the frigid water of the river, which flowed in torrents over the slippery, moss-covered rocks and boulders which lay strewn about the riverbed. Moses Schallenberger later recalled that his sister Elizabeth Townsend rode an Indian pony with her husband, Dr. Townsend, had traded for back at Fort Laramie. This is important to note because the Indian pony seemed to be much better suited to their current traveling conditions than the other horses. Because of this, the pony was used more often to ferry the members of the supplies across the river. At one point, after having crossed the river several times and being nearly worn out, the pony lost its footing and fell into the torrent. John Murphy, who was riding him at the time, fell into the icy water and was thrown against the huge boulders which filled the riverbed. The other members watched helplessly from the riverbank as he was swept down the raging river. The overhanging branches of the large willow tree offered his only chance for survival, and he was able to reach them and held on for dear life until the others arrived and pulled him to safety. A warm fire and some hot food soon had him fully recovered from the ordeal of his involuntary bath, and although they could now smile about it, every one of them knew just how lucky they were in having survived this potential disaster. They also knew from the surrounding terrain that they still had quite a distance to travel before reaching the safety of Sutter's new Helvetia Helvetia, I guess I've been saying that wrong, in Sacramento Valley. With no time to waste, they eventually worked their way down to the lower foothill region of the Sierra Nevada. Along the way, to satisfy their hunger, the immigrants would make an occasional meal from one of the many head of cattle that roamed about, grazing on the lush foothill grasses. The horseback party eventually reached the rancho of John Sinclair, located several miles northeast of New Helvetia, on the banks of the American River. The immigrants were guilt-stricken after finding out that the cattle, which they had been so freely enjoying for their meals, were owned by Mr. Sinclair. They offered to pay for the animals, but Sinclair would have none of it. In fact, he was quite happy that his animals had played a part in the immigrants surviving their arduous journey out of the mountains. Leaving the warmth and hospitality of Sinclair's rancho must have been difficult for the young immigrants, but they were now only a few miles away from completing their important and historic mission. They arrived at New Helvetia on December 10th, 1844, and were disappointed but not surprised that the main wagon party had not yet reached the confines of Sutter's fort. But they were shocked and dismayed when 3 days later, 17 men from the main wagon party arrived at the gates of the fort. Where were the other members of the wagon party? What had become of the families? The answer lay somewhere between Sutter's fort and the distant Sierra Nevada. There's a photo of Ellen Murphy. To find the answers to these questions, we must go back to November 14th, to the camp on the forks of the Truckee River, when the decision was made to divide the party into two separate groups. Having followed the horseback party on their journey over the Sierra Nevada to their safe arrival in New Helvetia, we now return to follow the tracks of the main wagon party as they continued their struggle to conquer the mighty Sierra summit. On November 15th, the wagon party broke camp and followed the westerly course of Truckee Creek. After a few miles, they arrived at the north shore of Truckee Lake, present Donner Lake, another of the several hundred pristine alpha lakes that dot the Sierra Nevada range, carved out by glacial activity thousands of years ago. Here they set up camp and spent several days exploring the sheer granite cliffs of the mountain barrier which lay before them, desperately searching for a practical pass in which to get their wagon through, as it had done since the journey up the Truckee River Canyon. The snow continued to fall, which only added to their problems in locating a pass. They realized that they must make another decision in what turned into a series of key decisions which they had made along their journey and which so far had greatly contributed to their success up to this point. It was agreed upon that 6 of the wagons would be left at the Truckee Lake camp. Joseph Foster, Alan Montgomery, and young Moses Schallenberger volunteered to stay behind and guard the wagons and their contents. But for now, the 3 men continued with the main party to help maneuver the remaining 5 wagons over the summit. The main wagon party continued along the north shore of Truckee Lake, route of present Donner Pass Road, to the small open meadow area located at the foot of the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada. Here they set up a base camp from which they would attempt their assault on the summit, which lay atop a steep, sheer granite slope rising over 1,000 feet above them. With nearly 2 feet of snow on the ground, they began the laborious ascent of the summit. First, they unloaded the wagons and carried the contents to the top of the pass. By leaving the 6 wagons back at the lake camp, they were able to double up the teams of oxen for pulling the remaining 5 wagons up the precipitous slope. About halfway up, they encountered a vertical ledge about 10 feet high. This formidable obstacle nearly ended their hard-fought battle with the mountain. After a desperate search, they were able to locate a rift in the rock just wide enough for the oxen to pass through, Unyoking the oxen, they worked all the animals through the narrow opening, one at a time. Once all the oxen were moved to a more level ground above the ledge, they were re-yoked in tandem teams. Chains and ropes were then lowered to the wagons below. While the oxen pulled from above, the men pushed from below. Working in unison, man and beast were able to complete this Herculean effort and suddenly move all 5 wagons up. And over the vertical ledge, and then continued up the slope to the waiting summit above. The wagons of the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party crossed the summit of the Sierra Nevada on November 25th, 1844. The first pioneer immigrant wagon party to accomplish this remarkable feat. Though considered by some historians to be opening of the California Trail, it would be more historically accurate to record their achievement as the opening of the truckee route of the California Trail, the first practicable wagon route across the Sierra Nevada. And I want to say that we still don't know exactly where this happened. We don't know where these wagons went over. And I've hiked all around that area. And if you go there and try to find it, and just look at what you're dealing with, it's unimaginable to see how they got through there. And many authors have theories, including this other book has theories of where it was, and they could be right. They have a lot of evidence and ideas, but really we still don't know where they took those wagons over, exactly where. But their journey was far from complete. From the summit they could clearly see the western slope of the Sierra Nevada as it lay spread before them with its seemingly endless chain of peaks and valleys, which would present a whole new series of obstacles and challenges to this courageous group of pioneers. With the wagon party continuing down the western slope of the Sierra, young Moses Schallenberger and the other 2 men returned to the 6 wagons left at the Truckee Lake camp. For now, we shall return to them. Once back at the camp, they quickly set about building a cabin. 2 days later, they had a snug little shelter about 12 by 14 feet. It was roofed with hides and pine boughs and included a log chimney. A single opening served as a window and doorway. This crude structure not only provided shelter for the 3 men as they kept their vigil over the wagons, it would later be the difference of life and death for the Breen family during their ordeal with the ill-fated Donner Reed party during the winter of 1846-1847. So, you have to remember that this Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party is before the Donner party. The site of this historic little cabin is where the present Pioneer Statue Monument is located at Donner Memorial State Park. And here's a illustration of Schallenberger's cabin. During their first night in the cabin, another storm rolled into the area, dropping a fresh blanket of snow, which soon reached depths of 3 feet. It continued to snow off and on for the next week, causing them great difficulty in trying to get around to hunt or locate firewood. When the snow approached the height of the roof of the cabin, their concern turned to alarm. They realized that whatever game normally would inhabit the area had either moved down to lower elevations or were now in hibernation. The few half-starved cows which they had butchered earlier for food would not suffice to feed them through the winter. Facing certain starvation, they decided to attempt a crossing of the summit and possibly overtake the wagon party. Apparently Foster and Montgomery had some prior experience with snowshoes. They fashioned 3 makeshift pairs out of hickory bows from the wagons, using strands of rawhide for the webbing. The 3 men then dried some of the beef, and with plenty of blankets and ammunition packed, they were off. Their progress through the ever-deepening snow was extremely difficult. Because they had fastened the snowshoes heel and toe to their boots, each step they took would add more and more weight from the wet, sticky snow to the improperly fitted snowshoes, bringing on severe exhaustion. Slowly working their way up to the summit, Moses Schallenberger, still a growing boy of 18 years, was overcome several times with severe leg cramps, causing them to stop and wait each time until the paroxysms had dissipated. That evening they eventually reached the summit. They built a fire, and as they huddled around the warming flames, trying in vain to chase the freezing chill out of their bones, they knew that their situation was looking ever more desperate. Adding to their anxiety was their growing concern over the fate of their families and the main wagon party which had gone on ahead. The next morning, after a night of little sleep, Schallenberger's physical condition had worsened. His legs were so stiff he could hardly move. He and his two companions knew that he would not be able to continue. Schallenberger later wrote, "I fully realized the situation and told them that I would return to the cabin and live as long as possible on the quarter of beef that was still there. And when it was all gone, I would start out again alone for California." The scene of their parting was truly a sad one. Although each of them realized the possibility that Schallenberger might not make it safely back to the cabin, no one spoke of it. With a simple, warm clasp of the hand accompanied by the parting words, "Goodbye, Moses," the two men turned reluctantly to continue on their way. They knew that this unselfish act of heroism by their young friend meant the difference in their surviving or perishing in the freezing snows of the Sierra. Moses Schallenberger did eventually make his way safely back to the cabin. His return trip was made easier by the hardened crust of the snow which had frozen during the previous night, allowing him to retrace his footsteps down the mountain without the use of the burdensome snowshoes. His fatigue was so great that he literally had to crawl over the threshold of the cabin door. Once inside, he settled in to rest and prepare for a solitary winter vigil. In time, he would regain most of his strength and youthful vigor. While he recuperated, he would spend much of the time reading various books and old newspapers which had been stored in trunks belonging to his brother-in-law, Dr. Townsend. Helped by the use of some steel-jawed traps which Captain Stevens had left behind at the lake camp, Schallenberger was able to trap coyote and fox for his meals, later recalling how he much preferred the taste of the fox. Although he was stronger, the depth of the snow would physically drain him each time he did go out on a hunt or to gather firewood. This hampered any thoughts of making an attempt at leaving the cabin and scaling the summit for the time being. Having followed the horseback party on their extraordinary journey across the Sierra Nevada to Sutter's Fort, and having seen how young Moses Schallenberger had made the best out of a bad situation back at the Truckee Lake camp, we shall return now to the main wagon party and retrace their tracks as they work their way down from the summit along the gradually declining western slope of the Sierra Nevada to the Sacramento Valley below. After their successful crossing of the Sierra Nevada summit back on November 25, 1844, the remaining 42 members of the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party, with their 5 wagons and exhausted oxen, continued to work their way through the ever-deepening snows, pioneering a new immigrant trail route with each step they took. Passing through a small valley, Summit Valley near present Soda Springs, they soon found the headwaters of a small, westerly flowing river, the present South Fork of the Yuba River. After 3 days of extremely difficult travel, and with the combination of ever-worsening weather conditions, the deepening snow packed, the complete exhaustion of the oxen and the added crisis of one of the women about to give birth, the immigrants realized that they could not take their wagons any further. They immediately set up a survival camp near present Big Bend on the banks of the South Fork of the Yuba River. That evening, the remaining members of the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party would have to make the most difficult, soul-searching decision of their long, arduous journey west. It was agreed upon by all the party members to leave the 5 wagons at the Yuba River camp. The women and children would be left in the charge of 2 men, James Miller and Patrick Martin. A crude cabin was hastily built for shelter, and most of the cattle were butchered as food supply for the camp. Here's a photo of Moses Schallenberger, one of James Miller, and there's one of Elizabeth Yuba Murphy. After about a week of making preparations for those who would remain at the Yuba River camp, and after the birth of Elizabeth Yuba Murphy to Mrs. Martin Murphy, Jr., the second child born during the journey, the remaining 17 men of the main wagon party reluctantly left the survival camp. Although the agony of having to leave their wives and children behind at this makeshift isolated campsite must have pushed them to the brink of succumbing to their seemingly hopeless situation, they knew that the only chance of survival for their loved ones would be for them to find their way to New Helvetia as quickly as possible, obtain help and supplies, and return to rescue their families at the Yuba River camp. The rescue party left the survival camp on December 6, 1844. Some of the men rode horses, doubling up when possible. Others walked. They drove the few remaining cattle ahead of them to help forge their way through the snow. They continued to follow the south fork of the Yuba River, and within 2 days' travel found themselves out of the heavy snowpack of the High Sierra. They soon entered a broad open valley, present Bear Valley, in eastern Nevada County, and located the headwaters of another stream, Bear River, which flowed in more westerly direction. They followed it down through the Sierra foothill region to where it enters the northern Sacramento Valley, near present-day Wheatland. Here they followed the waters of the Feather River to the Rio Sacramento. They reached New Helvetia on December 13, 1844, relieved to find their friends from the Horseback party who had arrived safely 3 days earlier. Unfortunately, their relief would be short-lived, for John Augustus Sutter had other plans in store for the immigrants. And this is a part of the story I just can't believe. Anyway, Mr. Sutter had placed himself right in the middle of a revolution that would later be known as the Micheltorena War. In fact, it was nothing more than a battle of overinflated egos between the current Mexican governor of California, Manuel Micheltorena, and his predecessor, Juan Bautista Alvarado. Sutter, who chose to side with Micheltorena, was in the midst of gathering his forces to do battle, when out of the blue arrived the two groups of the 21 well-armed men of the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party. Sutter must have presented a very strong case to the newly arrived immigrants who joined his army. Perhaps he promised them ample rewards of land for their service, or maybe he was able to convince them that their families were safer up in the mountain camps, away from the impending battle scene. At any rate, the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy men agreed to enlist in Sutter's troops, and on January 1, 1845, Sutter led his ragtag army south to meet up with Micheltorena and battle the forces of Alvarado near Santa Barbara, California. Several uneventful days later, near Monterey, Elisha Stevens and a few of the other enlistees had had enough of this charade, and on January 15th were given their leave by Sutter. They quickly returned to the fort for supplies, and with whatever assistance they could muster, prepared to leave for the mountains to rescue the remaining members at the Yuba River and Truckee Lake camps. This is, like I said, this is the part I can't believe. I can't believe they had their families stuck in a snow camp, and they went off to fight this war for a couple of weeks. Oh, more than a couple of weeks. Anyway, before the rescue party left the fort for the mountain camps, Elizabeth Townsend approached Dennis Martin, whose father was one of the two men left in charge of the Yuba River camp, and pleaded that he make an attempt to rescue her young brother Moses Schallenberger, who hopefully was still alive back at the Truckee Lake camp. Dennis Martin gave his word to Mrs. Townsend, and the rescue party left the fort on February 20, 1845. So now the camps have been up for a couple of months on their own. Several days later, the rescue party arrived at the survival camp on the Yuba River. The conditions at the camp had reached near disaster levels. The supply of meat from the butchered cattle had run out, and many of the camp members were reduced to eating boiled hides to ward off starvation. Realizing the severity of the situation, arrangements were immediately made to move the women and children down to the valley as soon as they could travel. The storms had tapered off for the first couple of weeks of February, so the depth of the snow had receded a bit and hardened to the surface, making their travel down out of the mountains to the valley a little less difficult. Dennis Martin continued up the western Sierra slope to fulfill the promise he made to Mrs. Townsend. He arrived at the Truckee Lake camp on February 28th and found Moses Schallenberger alive and well, although rather thin and weak from his limited diet of fox meat. The realization that this long, lonely winter vigil was nearly over gave Schallenberger an added inner strength. He later wrote, "My feelings can be better imagined than described." With the ever-present danger of a new storm arriving at any time, Martin made a new set of snowshoes for Schallenberger and taught him how to use them properly. The next morning they left the Truckee Lake camp and crossed the summit, pushing themselves to the limits of their physical ability. They worked their way down the western Sierra slope and were eventually able to catch up with the main rescue party on March 1, 1845. They camped at the banks of the Bear River near the future site of Johnson's Ranch to wait for the waters of the flooded river to recede before attempting a crossing. So, I've hiked around this area in the summertime. Making this trek in the summer would be a pretty big task. To do it in snow in the winter would be amazing. Incredible. A few days later, the rescue party with the remaining members of the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party arrived safely at New Helvetia and the confines of Sutter's fort, nearly a year to the day since some of them had left their homes in Missouri for California. In June of 1845, when the Sierra snowpack had sufficiently melted away, those who had left their wagons and other belongings back at the mountain camps returned to retrieve them. Schallenberger later recalled, "Meanwhile the snow had vanished from the lake, and the Indians had found the wagons in the cabin from which they had removed everything but the guns and ammunition." Perhaps the native people of the mountain region felt it only right and proper that their white brothers would be so generous and leave behind such fine items as compensation for being allowed to enter the home of their dark brothers. At any rate, the wagons of the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party finally completed their journey west, becoming the first wagons of their type to make tracks in the fertile soil of California's Sacramento Valley. The chroniclers of overland immigrant trail history would later record that in the year of 1844, a small group of people, comprised mostly of families, made a very important decision to leave the relative security of their homes in Missouri and immigrate west, seeking a new way of life in that enchanted land called California. Using simple farm wagons and oxen, this brave group of pioneers would cross nearly 3,000 miles of mostly uncharted country, fording flooded rivers, crossing dry, barren deserts, trudging through walls of snow, and successfully scaling with their wagons the summit of the mighty Sierra Nevada, and ultimately achieved their goal of reaching California. This courageous group of pioneers was the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party of 1844. Unfortunately, their historic accomplishment would be overshadowed by the notoriety given to the tragedy that befell the ill-fated Donner Reed party in the winter of 1846-47. Ultimately, this same mountain pass would be successfully crossed by thousands of immigrants as the last major obstacle before reaching California's fertile valleys and rich gold fields. Today, motorists and passengers cross the Sierra Nevada by means of highways and railways on or near the pass first opened by the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party over 150 years ago. I sincerely hope that this account of their journey to California will help the reader gain a better understanding and appreciation of their truly historic achievements and restore the courageous members of the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy party to their rightful place in the annals of Western U.S. history. And this is a photo of Mount Stevens, which was dedicated in 1994. So, as noted in this book, this pass didn't get Stevens' name, even though he was the hero that opened it up and established the route. It was called, and he had some bitterness about the fact that the pass had become known as Donner Pass for a party that failed to get over. And this photo is taken of Elisha Stevens in the South Bay region, what is now Silicon Valley. And in the heart of Silicon Valley, there is something that carries his namesake. a small creek, and which also has a road by that name, Stevens Creek, and that's the story of Elisha Stevens and the first pioneer wagons over the Sierra Nevada. Thanks for listening. I know this was a different kind of video than I usually make. Perhaps it was more for me than for YouTube, but I'm very passionate about this whole story, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening, and I'll hope to see you soon on another video. Take care.